Daniel 8 through 12. Well, congratulations again in getting through a really difficult book, especially near the end. But it ends with a bang, so let's get there. In chapter 8, we have previously had noticed through that image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt about the passing of four kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And in chapter 8, we read in verse 3, I lifted my eyes and saw there standing beside the river a ram, which had two horns. And then in verse 5, and I was considering this, and suddenly a male goat came up from the west. This ram and this goat are picturing the two middle kingdoms of these four. We hear this in verses 20 and 21. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Medo-Persia, that'd be Cyrus, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And of course, that would be the king of Alexander the Great. So then in verse 23, we have even mention of a king arising, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. That's Antiochus Epiphanes in 164. Now we know that Daniel is living at the end of his life in the kingdom of Medo-Persia. When we have the mention of Greece and even this very clear prophecy of Alexander the Great and such, it is what gives some critics the impression that Daniel is writing from this period, because the predictions are so careful that many people think that Daniel is a book actually being written in the 2nd century BC. But there's no reason to do that, in the sense that God can foretell the future, so I'm very content having Daniel living, as it seems, in the time of Medo-Persia. Chapter 9 of Daniel is one of my favorite chapters because it again rehearses through a prayer of Daniel many of the great themes we've heard before. This is Daniel speaking in verse 4 of chapter 9. O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him. The word love in Aramaic is the same as in Hebrew, ahav. I just love that combination again. We don't hear this too often we think of aman, or faithfulness, but love and keeping his commands. Again, answering that question we've been seeing from the beginning of our story, which Elohim? There in verse 4. O Lord, this is in verse 7. O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face, because of the unfaithfulness which we have committed against you. Daniel is admitting, as a member of Abraham's family, the reason they're in exile is because not of behavioral sin or original sin. It's because of the unfaithfulness to this storyline right here that has caused exile. Verse 16, O Lord, according to all of your righteousness, let your anger and your fury be turned away. To ask God to act according to his righteousness is to ask him to think in terms or act in terms of his mercy. Righteousness means I will be doing right by what I have promised, and that promise of loving people in covenant who in turn love him, that means that you can ask God to be righteous and thus be merciful. And then verse 19, O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. We really need to get rid of the idea that forgiveness demands payment. Before we get to the New Testament, we've got to get it out of our system in thinking that forgiveness needs some kind of a transaction in order to work. Daniel is not performing any sacrifices in Babylon or in Persia, and yet he asks God to forgive the nation, and of course God can do that as he would like. So, well, what happens in chapter 9, verse 21, is we have Gabriel mentioned. Now, Gabriel's also been mentioned back in 8:16. So there's two mentions of this of the Elohim named Gabriel in Daniel, one in 9 and one in 8. But in 9:21, he comes to Daniel and he says this, that 77s are determined upon your people. 77s. Now that means, everyone seems to agree, 490 years of time are determined upon your people. There's a lot of debate as to how those 490 years are to be determined. Is that literal years? Is that figurative years? Jesus will someday say, don't forgive 7 times, but forgive 70 times 7. Clearly a metaphorical use of this term. And so could this be the same way? Either way, what we know is that by the time we get to the days of Jesus, because if you add 490 to Daniel's period here, we are coming into the days of Jesus himself. The point is that in the days of Jesus, there was a fierce expectation that Yahweh was about to act. That comes from this promise that Gabriel came and gave Daniel because of his prayer. Well, then this final prophecy of the book of Daniel, it's a long one, it's a tough one, and again, congratulations for getting through it. It extends from chapter 10, verse 5 and on. Let me read how it begins. I lifted my eyes, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning. His eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sounds of his words like the voice of a multitude. Now, too long to get into some of the facts here that I could, but that clearly is a description of how an Elohim appears to a human. Eyes of flame and arms like bronze. The word Hebrew word for bronze is one of the forms of that word Nakash back in Genesis 3, the serpent that talked with Adam and Eve. The point is that I think what's going on here is Daniel is being introduced to a man-type figure who is an Elohim come to earth. Verse 10, suddenly a hand touched me. It seems that this man sticks out his hand and touches Daniel, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. It puts Daniel almost into a paralyzed state. Then he said to me, and the quotation begins there in 10:10. Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand, and actually it's in verse 20, that we have a beginning of a prediction or a prophecy. Chapter 10, verse 20, where this man tells Daniel about something to come. But before we get there, one of the things that this person says, this man says to Daniel, interestingly, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. So it sounds like he is coming from here down to assist Daniel. But then notice what he says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Well, again, remember how we speak of these kingdoms having divine patronage to deities up here. It says, this person says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes. Now, Michael, again, is a named deity in the Old Testament. He is a loyal deity. Michael came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the king of Persia. So I don't know how to draw this, but this being wants to get to Daniel. This being doesn't want him to go. The prince of the kingdom of Persia, the Elohim of the kingdom of Medo-Persia, and Michael comes to assist in this battle. So clearly this is one of those moments again of what we call spiritual warfare, where we have at least 3 Elohim going at it. And finally this being is able to get to Daniel by the help of Michael. And we have then a long prediction or prophecy beginning in chapter 10, verse 20. Then he said, and the quotation mark there goes all the way through chapter 12, verse 4. So what that prophecy is that finishes out the book of Daniel includes warring kings, a specific battle, in fact, that we know took place in 168 BC. That's in chapter 11, verse 31. We have the beginning of the celebration of Hanukkah, which is mentioned in a battle in chapter 11, verse 34. The year would be 164. But the most important part of this quotation, by the way, that ends again in 12:4, happens in 12:2, which says this. And again, this is this man speaking to Daniel. Many who sleep will awake, some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting contempt. It's one of the great clear promises in the Old Testament of a resurrection. Very few promises of that, but it is in Daniel 12:2, and it comes from this person here. Now, let me recommend, if you read Revelation chapter 1 and compare it to Daniel 10, verses 5 and 6, they almost sound the same. My point is this: if Jesus ever were to appear in the Old Testament, my recommendation would be here in Daniel chapter 10. The identification of how this person is described seems to be eerily similar in both. So my thought is possibly that was Jesus who appeared to Daniel.